The studio lights were bright. The smiles were practiced. The applause sounded routine. But within seconds of the interview beginning, something shifted in the room that no one in the audience expected. Subscribe to The Truth Narrator, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It was supposed to be another friendly daytime television appearance. Ariana Grande, one of the most recognizable pop stars in the world, was seated at the table of The View, a show known for its candid conversations and unfiltered questions. Across from her sat Whoopi Goldberg, a veteran broadcaster and moderator with decades of experience navigating sensitive topics on live television. The format was familiar. The atmosphere, at least at first glance, seemed warm. Yet what unfolded during those live minutes would leave viewers replaying the moment long after the broadcast ended. Because this wasn't just a promotional interview. It wasn't just small talk about music, tours, or upcoming projects. It became something else. Something quieter. Something heavier. And for a brief stretch of live television, the studio fell into a kind of silence that rarely happens on daytime TV. To understand why that moment felt so significant, it helps to understand the people sitting at that table. Ariana Grande had built her career in the public eye from a young age. From Nickelodeon star to global pop icon, her journey had been watched, analyzed, praised, and criticized by millions. She was known for her powerful voice, her careful public image, and her ability to remain poised in interviews despite years of scrutiny. She had faced personal tragedy, public controversies, and intense media attention, yet she often presented herself with composure and professionalism during live appearances. Whoopi Goldberg, on the other hand, was known for something different. As the moderator of The View, she had developed a reputation for asking direct questions and guiding conversations into deeper territory when necessary. Her style was calm but firm. She didn't interrupt for drama. She didn't raise her voice for effect. Instead, she often allowed moments to breathe, allowing guests to reveal more than they intended simply through silence. That combination, a globally known celebrity accustomed to media control and a host experienced in live, unscripted conversation, created a dynamic that viewers could feel even before anything unusual was said. Because live television has one rule that cannot be avoided. There are no edits. Every pause, every glance, every shift in posture is visible. And when a guest is caught off guard, the audience sees it in real time. The appearance had been scheduled as part of Ariana's promotional circuit. Like many celebrities, she was moving from one show to another, answering similar questions, repeating familiar stories, smiling through rehearsed segments. The rhythm of these interviews is predictable. Compliments, laughter, a clip from a music video, a quick anecdote, a friendly goodbye. But The View is not structured like most talk shows. It's a round table, a conversation rather than a monologue. And the hosts don't always follow the expected script. From the moment Ariana took her seat, viewers noticed how attentive Whoopi was. She wasn't flipping through cue cards. She wasn't looking down at notes. She was watching Ariana carefully, listening with the focus of someone preparing to ask more than the usual questions. The early part of the segment felt normal. They discussed Ariana's career, her growth as an artist, and the challenges of fame. Ariana responded with the grace and warmth she is known for. The audience laughed at the right moments. The conversation flowed, but there was an undercurrent that hadn't yet surfaced. Ariana had, over the years, spoken publicly about mental health, the pressures of celebrity life, and the emotional toll of constant public attention. These were topics she had addressed in controlled interviews, often on her own terms. She was open but measured, honest but careful. Whoopi, with her experience, knew how to approach such topics without making them feel rehearsed. And then came the moment where the conversation subtly changed direction. It wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation, no raised voice. In fact, that's what made it more noticeable. Whoopi asked a question that sounded simple on the surface. A question about how Ariana truly felt during some of the most difficult periods of her public life. The wording wasn't accusatory. It wasn't sensational. It was calm, thoughtful, and direct. And for the first time in the interview, Ariana didn't immediately answer. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but on live television, a few seconds can feel unusually long. The co-host stopped moving. The audience grew quiet. Ariana's expression shifted from polite smile to something more reflective. Her eyes lowered. Her posture changed slightly, as if the question had reached somewhere deeper than expected. Whoopi didn't interrupt the silence. She didn't rescue the moment with another question. She simply waited. That silence is what viewers remembered. Because in that pause, it became clear that this wasn't just another promotional stop. Something real had surfaced. Something unscripted. Something that Ariana had not prepared a ready-made answer for. She eventually responded, carefully choosing her words, but the tone had changed. Her voice was softer, slower, more deliberate. It was the kind of response that felt less like a celebrity interview and more like a personal reflection unfolding in real time. The audience in the studio sensed it. The co-hosts sensed it. And millions watching from home could feel it too. There was no controversy, no argument, no dramatic exchange. Yet the emotional weight of that moment stood out precisely because it was so quiet. And that is why this particular appearance on The View stood apart from dozens of other interviews Ariana had done around the same time. Because live television sometimes reveals more through stillness than through sound. Viewers later described the moment as uncomfortable, not because anything inappropriate was said, but because it felt deeply personal. As if the protective layer that usually exists between celebrity and audience had briefly thinned. Whoopi's role in that moment was subtle but crucial. She didn't push. She didn't dramatize. She simply allowed Ariana the space to answer honestly, even if that honesty came wrapped in hesitation. For a few minutes, the show felt less like entertainment and more like a genuine human conversation unfolding without a script. And as the segment continued, the energy in the studio remained slightly different. More thoughtful, more careful, as if everyone present understood that something meaningful had just occurred. But what exactly was asked? What did Ariana say that created that shift? And why did that quiet exchange leave such a lasting impression on viewers who were used to fast-paced celebrity interviews? Because the real impact of that live moment wasn't in the question alone. It was in everything that led up to it. Before Ariana Grande ever walked onto the set of The View that morning, the interview already carried a weight that most daytime appearances do not. She was in the middle of a period in her career where public attention wasn't focused only on her music. Conversations about her life had become louder than conversations about her art. Headlines, commentary, and constant social media discussion had followed her for months. Some of it supportive, some of it intrusive, all of it relentless. By the time she sat at that table, Ariana was no longer just promoting a project. She was navigating a public narrative that had grown far beyond her control. For years, Ariana had been open about the emotional toll of fame. She had spoken about anxiety, trauma, and the pressure of living under a microscope. After the Manchester concert tragedy in 2017, she became one of the few global celebrities to openly discuss the lasting psychological impact of such an event. Viewers had seen her vulnerability before. They had seen her cry on stage. They had heard her talk about therapy and healing. But those conversations usually happened in environments she chose, with interviewers she trusted, and in formats where she could set the pace. Daytime live television is different. There is no second take, no pause for composure, no opportunity to rephrase an answer after hearing how it sounded out loud. At the same time, The View had built its identity around conversations that go deeper than standard press junket material. The hosts were known for moving past surface-level discussion, especially when a guest's public life had become a topic of national conversation. Ariana's team knew this. They knew the show's reputation. They knew Whoopi Goldberg's interviewing style. But they also knew Ariana's strength, her ability to remain calm, articulate, and thoughtful under pressure. Still, there was an underlying tension that viewers could sense even before the pivotal question was asked. In the weeks leading up to the appearance, Ariana had been the subject of intense media attention related to her personal relationships and the scrutiny surrounding her private life. Entertainment outlets had debated her choices. Social media users had dissected her every public move. Whether fair or not, the narrative surrounding her had shifted from admiration for her talent to speculation about her character. This is the kind of atmosphere that makes live interviews unpredictable. Because while a celebrity may prepare for questions about their work, they can't fully prepare for how personal topics might be framed in a public conversation. Whoopi Goldberg had a long history of handling sensitive discussions without turning them into spectacle. She had interviewed politicians, activists, and celebrities through moments of public controversy. Her approach was rarely confrontational. Instead, she often asked questions in a way that invited reflection rather than defense. That style can be disarming. A direct accusation is easy to deflect. A thoughtful question about how someone feels is much harder to navigate. As the interview progressed, Ariana answered early questions with the professionalism she had developed over more than a decade in the spotlight. She smiled. She thanked the hosts. She spoke about her creative process, her growth as an artist, and the importance of self-care. But the co-hosts, including Whoopi, were listening for something deeper. The conversation slowly edged toward topics that weren't listed in promotional talking points. They discussed how public opinion affects mental health. They mentioned how difficult it can be for celebrities to maintain privacy in an era where every action is analyzed in real time. These were still safe subjects. Broad, general, but they were building toward something more personal. Ariana's posture began to change subtly. She leaned forward slightly. Her tone softened. She was no longer speaking in rehearsed sentences. She was speaking more slowly, choosing her words carefully, as if she knew where the conversation might be heading. The audience didn't know it yet, but the groundwork for that silent moment was already being laid. Because when someone has spent months in the center of public judgment, a simple question about how they are coping can feel heavier than expected. Whoopi had observed this pattern many times before with other guests. The public often assumes celebrities are unaffected by headlines. But when given the space to speak honestly, many reveal how deeply those narratives affect them. The timing of Ariana's appearance made this especially relevant. She was at a crossroads between promoting her work and addressing, whether directly or indirectly, the emotional weight of constant public scrutiny. The co-hosts referenced the difficulty of being misunderstood in the media. They spoke about how narratives can form without the person at the center having any control over them. Ariana nodded as they spoke, visibly relating to the subject. It was in this context that Whoopi prepared to ask the question that would change the tone of the interview. It wasn't about gossip. It wasn't about scandal. It was about something far more personal. How Ariana was feeling internally while the world was talking about her externally. That kind of question bypasses public relations training. It bypasses rehearsed responses. It asks the person, not the celebrity, to speak. And when a person has been under emotional strain, that question can bring everything to the surface at once. Viewers watching at home could sense that the conversation had reached a delicate point. The laughter had faded. The rhythm had slowed. Even the audience applause between segments felt quieter, more restrained. Ariana's hands were folded in her lap. She was listening carefully. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't steering the conversation back toward safer topics. She seemed to understand that this moment required honesty. But honesty on live television can feel risky, especially when millions are watching and every word will be replayed, analyzed, and quoted. The producers didn't cut to a commercial break. The cameras stayed fixed. The studio remained still. And then Whoopi spoke. The way she framed the question wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, almost conversational. But it was personal enough that Ariana's expression changed immediately. It was clear that this was not something she had prepared to answer in front of a live audience. The silence that followed didn't come from confusion. It came from reflection. For a few seconds, Ariana looked down, as if gathering her thoughts. The co-hosts remained still. Whoopi didn't repeat the question. She allowed the pause to exist. And in that pause, viewers realized they were watching something unscripted and deeply human unfold in real time. What Ariana eventually said would resonate with many who had followed her journey. But it was the quiet before her response that made the moment unforgettable. Because it revealed the emotional reality behind the headlines, behind the music, behind the carefully curated public image. It showed a young woman sitting under bright studio lights, searching for the right words to explain how it feels when the entire world seems to have an opinion about your life. And that is where the interview crossed from routine television into something far more intimate. The shift happened so quietly that, for a brief second, it almost went unnoticed. Whoopi Goldberg leaned slightly forward, her tone steady and calm, and asked Ariana a question that sounded simple on the surface. She didn't reference headlines. She didn't mention controversy. She didn't frame it as an accusation or a challenge. Instead, she asked how Ariana was truly doing while so much of her life had been discussed publicly by people who did not know her. There was no dramatic music. No change in camera angle, just a wide shot of the table and a guest who suddenly looked very still. Ariana's smile faded, not abruptly, but gently, as if the expression had naturally reached its end. Her eyes lowered toward her hands. Her shoulders relaxed in a way that suggested the question had reached somewhere deeper than expected. For the first time in the interview, she did not answer right away. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but on live television, that pause felt unusually long. Long enough for the audience to stop shifting in their seats. Long enough for the co-hosts to remain motionless. Long enough for viewers at home to feel that something unplanned was happening. Whoopi did not interrupt the moment. She didn't try to soften it with humor. She simply waited. Ariana took a small breath before speaking. The kind of breath someone takes when they are trying to organize thoughts that are more emotional than rehearsed. When she began to talk, her voice was softer than before. Slower, more deliberate. The polished rhythm of a celebrity promoting a project had disappeared. In its place was the careful tone of someone speaking honestly, aware that every word mattered. She explained that it had been difficult to navigate hearing opinions about her life from strangers. She spoke about the emotional strain of feeling misunderstood. She acknowledged that while she had learned to be strong in public, that strength did not mean she was unaffected. Her words were measured, but her expression revealed more than the sentences themselves. There was a visible vulnerability in her eyes that viewers were not used to seeing during routine interviews. The camera remained steady, capturing every detail. The way her hands remained clasped, the way she avoided eye contact for a moment as she searched for the right phrasing, the way her voice occasionally paused as if she were deciding how much to reveal. The studio was completely silent. The usual background sounds of daytime television, papers shifting, audience murmurs, small reactions from co-hosts, were absent. Everyone seemed aware that this was not a moment to interrupt. Whoopi listened with the patience of someone who understood that the real value of the conversation was happening in the space Ariana had been given to speak. At one point, Ariana admitted that constant public judgment can make a person question themselves, even when they know the narrative is incomplete. She spoke about trying to protect her mental health while living in a world where privacy no longer felt possible. She didn't blame anyone. She didn't defend herself. She simply described how it felt. That honesty changed the energy in the room. The interview no longer felt like entertainment. It felt like witnessing someone articulate the emotional cost of fame in real time. A co-host nodded quietly. Another looked down at the table. No one interrupted. No one rushed to the next topic. The cameras stayed on Ariana, and the audience could see the effort it took for her to continue speaking calmly. At one moment, her voice wavered slightly. Not enough to break, but enough to reveal how personal the subject was. She paused, pressed her lips together briefly, and continued. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Because viewers realized they were watching a person who had been composed for so long finally speak, without the usual protective layer of performance. Whoopi responded not with another question, but with a simple acknowledgement. She thanked Ariana for being honest. She didn't attempt to summarize or analyze what had just been said. She let the weight of Ariana's words remain as they were. That restraint is what made the moment more powerful. There was no attempt to turn it into a headline. No effort to create drama. Just a shared understanding that something genuine had been expressed. For a few seconds after Ariana finished speaking, the silence returned. Not an uncomfortable silence, but a reflective one. The kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room is processing what they have just heard. The audience eventually applauded, but the applause felt softer than usual. Respectful rather than enthusiastic. Ariana lifted her head slightly and offered a small smile, as if grateful that the moment had passed without becoming something sensational. But viewers at home knew they had just seen something rare on daytime television. A celebrity answering a deeply personal question without deflection, without rehearsed phrases, and without losing composure. The conversation slowly moved on to other topics, but the tone of the interview had changed permanently. There was a new carefulness in the way questions were asked, a new thoughtfulness in Ariana's responses. The earlier lightness never fully returned, because once a live conversation reaches that level of honesty, it cannot go back to small talk. The cameras captured Ariana taking a sip of water, her hands still slightly tense. The co-hosts resumed the discussion, but the emotional echo of the moment remained present in the studio. Viewers would later say that this was the part of the interview they replayed. Not because of anything controversial, but because of how quietly powerful it was. It showed that behind the fame, behind the headlines, and behind the polished interviews, there was a person trying to make sense of being watched by millions. And it showed how a single, thoughtful question asked at the right time on live television could reveal more than an entire press tour of rehearsed answers. As the segment neared its end, Ariana appeared more reflective than when she had arrived. The experience seemed to have shifted her from promotional mode into something more introspective. Whoopi thanked her again for coming. Ariana thanked the hosts. The audience applauded once more. But the moment that stayed with everyone wasn't the goodbye. It was the silence that had filled the studio when Ariana first looked down, gathering the courage to speak honestly. If you want to understand why that brief pause on live television still resonates with viewers today, stay with the truth narrator as we continue exploring what happened after the cameras kept rolling. When the conversation moved forward, the studio did not immediately return to its earlier rhythm. There was a subtle change in the air that everyone present could feel, but no one directly addressed. The laughter that usually fills the space between questions was replaced with a more measured tone. The co-hosts spoke gently, choosing their words with extra care. Ariana remained composed, but her expression carried a thoughtful seriousness that had not been there at the beginning of the segment. It was as if the interview had quietly crossed an invisible line. The audience, too, seemed more restrained. Their reactions were softer, their applause less energetic. They were no longer watching a celebrity promote a project. They were watching a person who had just shared something emotionally honest on live television. Whoopi Goldberg guided the conversation forward with the steadiness of someone who understood that the moment needed space to settle. She did not rush to lighten the mood. She did not pivot abruptly to unrelated topics. Instead, she allowed the discussion to continue at a slower pace, acknowledging the shift without naming it. Ariana responded to the next few questions with calm professionalism, but there was a new depth in her answers. She spoke more thoughtfully, often pausing before replying. Her words carried the tone of someone still processing what had just been said. At one point, she smiled politely, but it was different from the bright, rehearsed smile that had opened the segment. This one seemed quieter, more reflective. The co-hosts offered supportive comments rather than playful banter. One of them mentioned how difficult it must be to live under constant scrutiny. Another spoke about the importance of protecting mental well-being. These remarks felt less like television conversation and more like genuine acknowledgement. The cameras occasionally cut to the audience, where viewers sat unusually still, listening closely. There were no visible distractions, no restless movement. The room had taken on the atmosphere of a serious discussion rather than a daytime talk show. What made the aftermath so noticeable was how normal everything tried to appear on the surface. The set looked the same. The lighting hadn't changed. The segment structure continued as planned. But emotionally, the interview had shifted into different territory. Ariana took another sip of water. She nodded as the host spoke. She answered questions clearly, but the spontaneity from earlier had been replaced by careful reflection. Whoopi, in particular, maintained steady eye contact. She didn't overcompensate with jokes or lighten the mood artificially. Her approach suggested an understanding that what had happened did not need to be covered up or redirected. It simply needed to be respected. This is one of the rare qualities of live television that cannot be replicated in edited formats. When a moment unfolds authentically, everyone in the room must adjust to it in real time. And that is exactly what happened. The segment eventually approached its scheduled conclusion. There were closing remarks, brief mentions of Ariana's work, and polite expressions of gratitude. But even in these final moments, the energy remained thoughtful. When the audience applauded at the end, it felt sincere rather than enthusiastic. The applause carried appreciation rather than excitement. As the cameras prepared to cut away, Ariana leaned slightly back in her chair, exhaling in a way that suggested emotional relief. It was a small gesture, but noticeable. The kind of gesture that reveals how much effort it takes to remain composed during an unexpectedly personal conversation. The hosts stood, exchanged thanks, and the show transitioned to the next segment. To a casual viewer, it might have looked like any other interview wrapping up. But those who had watched closely could tell that something meaningful had occurred. Backstage, according to people familiar with live television routines, moments like this are often discussed quietly by production teams. Not because anything went wrong, but because something genuine happened that no one had planned. The interview had not followed a script, yet it had revealed something more authentic than scripted content ever could. For Ariana, the immediate aftermath meant stepping away from the table and returning to the backstage environment, where interviews typically end with handshakes, polite conversation, and a quick move to the next commitment. But emotionally, she had just experienced something different from the usual promotional appearance. For Whoopi and the co-hosts, It meant recognizing that they had facilitated a conversation that went deeper than intended, without ever pushing for drama. Viewers at home, meanwhile, were already reacting. Social media began to reflect what people had felt during the broadcast. Many commented on the silence. Others mentioned how rare it was to see such an honest exchange on daytime television. Some simply wrote about how moved they felt watching Ariana speak so openly. No controversy emerged from the interview. No headlines accused anyone of wrongdoing. Instead, the discussion centered on the authenticity of the moment. That is what made it stand out. In an era where celebrity interviews are often carefully controlled and rehearsed, this felt unscripted and real. It reminded viewers that behind the fame, there is a person dealing with emotions that cannot always be summarized in sound bites. As the show continued without her, Ariana's presence still lingered in the atmosphere of the studio. The hosts returned to their usual format, but there was a brief period where their tone remained more thoughtful than usual, as if the conversation had left an impression on them as well. For the audience, the memory of the interview wasn't tied to a dramatic exchange or a shocking statement. It was tied to a feeling, the feeling of watching someone speak honestly under bright lights with millions watching. And that feeling stayed with viewers long after the broadcast ended. In the days that followed the broadcast, the clip began circulating online. Not because of controversy, but because of the quiet power of what viewers had witnessed. People shared the moment not with outrage, but with reflection. Comments focused on Ariana's honesty, on the respectful way the question had been asked, and on how rare it felt to see a celebrity pause and truly consider how to answer something personal on live television. Media outlets that covered the interview didn't frame it as a confrontation. Instead, they described it as a sincere exchange that revealed the emotional weight celebrities carry behind carefully managed public images. The headlines weren't dramatic. They were thoughtful. They highlighted vulnerability, composure, and the impact of a simple question asked at the right time. For Ariana, the interview became part of a larger narrative about how she had matured in the public eye. Over the years, audiences had watched her grow from a teenage performer into an artist navigating complex personal experiences under constant scrutiny. This appearance added another layer to that journey. It showed not just resilience, but self-awareness. Fans responded with support. Many expressed appreciation for her willingness to speak openly about the emotional toll of public judgment. Others shared how her words resonated with their own experiences of feeling misunderstood or overwhelmed by outside opinions. The moment also reinforced something viewers often forget. Celebrities are human beings first. They may live in a different world of visibility, but they experience stress, doubt, and vulnerability just like anyone else. Whoopi Goldberg's role in the exchange was also widely noted. Commentators pointed out how her calm presence and willingness to allow silence created the space for something genuine to happen. She didn't sensationalize the topic. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened. That listening is what many viewers remembered most. In the broader context of daytime television, the interview stood out because it did not rely on entertainment value. There was no viral joke, no dramatic argument, no shocking revelation. Instead, the most memorable part was a few seconds of silence followed by an honest response. And that, in itself, became culturally significant. In a media landscape driven by speed, edits, and sound bites, this moment slowed everything down. It reminded audiences that meaningful conversations do not always come from loud exchanges. Sometimes they come from quiet honesty. Over time, the clip continued to resurface whenever discussions about mental health, celebrity pressure, or media scrutiny appeared online. It became an example of how interviews can be conducted with empathy rather than spectacle. For Ariana, it marked another instance where she demonstrated composure in an environment where many might have felt exposed. She did not deflect. She did not avoid the subject. She answered in a way that was measured, thoughtful, and sincere. That authenticity strengthened the connection many viewers felt toward her. It showed that behind the polished performances and public appearances, she was willing to acknowledge the emotional realities of her life. For The View, the segment reinforced the show's reputation as a place where real conversations can happen unexpectedly. The format allowed for depth that traditional talk shows often do not reach. Years from now, viewers may not remember every detail of what was said, but they will remember how it felt to watch that moment unfold live. They will remember the pause, the stillness, the careful way Ariana chose her words. the respectful way Whoopi allowed the silence to exist. Because sometimes the most powerful television moments are not the loudest ones. They are the ones where honesty quietly takes center stage. And that is why this interview continues to be referenced when people talk about authentic live television. It wasn't about drama. It wasn't about conflict. It was about a simple, human exchange that revealed more than anyone expected. If you appreciate storytelling that uncovers the real moments behind live television, subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and share this story with others who value honest conversations.